Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of this season's Declassify podcast. And today's episode is one that I'm very excited and admittedly very, very nervous for, as I welcome our first non-Aussie guest. I am very pleased to introduce today's guest, internationally renowned and Grammy-nominated violinist Robert McDuffie. Robert has appeared as a soloist with the world's most foremost orchestras, has toured with them, and is the founder for both the Rome Chamber Music Festival in Italy and the Robert McDuffie Center for Strings at Mercer University. Amongst all his achievements, he has also given the world premiere of Philip Glass's Concerto No. 2, the American Four Seasons, and Mike Mills's Concerto for Violin, Rock Band, and String Orchestra, and has toured the US and world with several premieres of key contemporary American works. Additionally, he has recorded an enormous variety of violin concertos, including works by Bernstein, Glass, Adams, Barber, and Mendelssohn. And with that, it is an absolute pleasure for me to welcome on board Robert McDuffie. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with me as part of this podcast. I really appreciate that.
Oh, it is my pleasure. I read about you, and Chris told me about you, and you're doing good work, and congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that I somehow will live up to that today. Well, in that case, I'm just going to jump straight in. Normally, it's such a struggle to write and ask the first question, and in your case, I think that I've actually failed to devise one. So I'm going to jump straight to one that might open the doorway to discussing various issues about the classical music industry. So my first question is, what do you believe that music, or rather classical music in particular, means in contemporary society?
Yeah, you went deep with that one, didn't you? Well, of course, I could use all the cliches that it feeds your soul, that it, children listening to classical music become more civil. They listen when adults speak. I mean, those are all good talking points. But I think classical music and the term classical music is kind of a misnomer, I think, in these days as well, but we're kind of stuck with it. So I think we're going to have to keep using that that term. I think as society shifts, classical music has got to reach out to the wider and larger culture. I think that is the if we don't use our skills and our love for our art to connect to a larger culture, then we will have failed. I think we're really struggling to be relevant these days in society. So I think the best thing I can say about music in general is that great music can heal. I think that's I think when there are difficult times, we turn to meaningful music. I think of Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings at JFK's funeral. I've been doing several concerts with Anna DeVere Smith as she recites Letter from Birmingham Jail, and she's an activist, and she believes that music can heal. Words matter, actions count. So I think we're healers in some way without sounding too self-aggrandizing. And but if we don't, but if we stay in a bubble, I think we're gonna become even more irrelevant than we are now.
I was actually having a conversation not too long ago with a lot of my friends who are not classical musicians or people who regularly attend anything that's related to classical music, and they have the presumption, or they believe, that most of classical music is kind of like a heritage art form, that it's replaying of historical collections rather than anything that is contemporary. And coming from me as someone who's been trained in classical music, I partly see it that way, but I can understand where I'm from in Australia, we don't have such a huge track record of commissioning new music. So the idea of hearing music from someone who has composed it, who is living, seems so out of place for a lot of people that I've encountered who don't know too much about the classical music world. Would you say that commissioning is one method into getting a larger audience to attend?
So I have a music festival in Italy, and I joke that the subtitle should be "We'll never punish the audience." Yes, commissioning is hugely important, but when I came out of Juilliard, I felt that it was my duty. I was waving the flag for American composers. It was my duty to support them, and it didn't really matter if they spoke to me personally at that time. I just felt it was just the right thing to do. As I've become older, yes, I absolutely want to connect with living American composers, especially for me, but not just for the sake of doing it. I mean, it really has to be something so personal, and it has to speak to me, but many times I just put myself in the audience's situation. I don't want to be told what's good. I want to experience it without anybody telling me beforehand that it's an important work of an important composer. I think that's our duty. It's just to come out and leave it up to the audience. I remember playing a piece by Tobias Picker once at the University of Georgia, and I'd invited a couple of friends, non-musicians, with whom I grew up, and and before the piece, it's a great piece, by the way, I said, "This is a very important piece by a very important American composer, Tobias Picker." And then I played it, and it was successful, but they came backstage and said, "Who are you to tell us that it's important, that he's an important, isn't it up to us? I mean, if we don't like it, does that make us stupid?" I mean, that's, there's so much, I think there's fear with classical music public, when do you clap? A lot of these composers' names are names you can't even pronounce. Musicians are up there in white tie and tails. I mean, my Lord, it's really, we have to, we do have to make our art more contemporary, and to the extent that we speak through living composers is great. I certainly don't want to stop playing the music of dead white European males. I mean, they're great composers for a reason. But that should be our North Star as we go to the next level.
I mean, you mentioned the white and black tails. Sometimes I feel like the kind of procedure involved in classical music unintentionally ostracizes people. You're right. Sometimes I don't even know when to clap. I have to wait for someone else to start the round.
Just clap, whatever. I've been doing these concerts with Mike Mills, one of the founders of the rock band REM. And he wrote a concerto for violin and rock band. He did a beautiful job. And he speaks beforehand and says, "Listen, clap. When you feel like clapping, just do it. If you want to yell, yell. I mean, we love it. So just go ahead and do it." So it certainly has, I think that's all softened me up a little bit. So I would encourage anyone to clap whenever they feel like it.
Excellent advice. I'm going to take that on board the next time I go to a concert. Well, I was wondering then, now that you've mentioned Mills and him speaking to the audience, I've rarely had the chance, every time I go to see an orchestral performance or an opera or something like that, very rarely do I actually get to engage with the musicians on the stage beyond them being in the orchestra pit or the orchestra. Do you think perhaps there could be kind of a fourth wall breakdown if we got more engagement with the musicians themselves and that we got to hear their voices beyond their instruments?
Yes. I enjoy talking from the stage. There's some musicians who just don't talk very well, and they should keep playing. But there are musicians who are very articulate and entertaining at the same time, and I think those are the ones that should be identified to bring our music even further. I just I think if you have a talent of speaking in front of an audience as well as playing in front of an audience, that'll most likely help you get your point across. But sometimes the music is so powerful. I mean, I fell in love with the violin 8 years after I'd started playing the violin. I never loved it. I hated to practice. My mother made me practice. But it was Itzhak Perlman who came to my little town in Georgia. He never said a word. He just started playing, and it just killed me. And sometimes music is so powerful you don't need words. But there are historical references that may be relevant to the piece you're playing, and if it's the right thing to do, then absolutely, you should do it. Again, not just for the sake of speaking. Just do it when it's when it works.
Sometimes it's nice to get a chance to hear some storytelling behind the pieces.
I agree. I mean, if you see if you can experience the person behind the music, behind the performer, obviously that is a wonderful thing. I mean, many orchestras have after-concert talks with members of the orchestra, and many times pre-concert talks as well. I prefer the post-concert talks. I don't, I'd rather practice and see if my fingers are moving before I play. But I think all of that is hugely important to not only sustain your audience, but to build audiences as well.
In order to build a brand new audience, say for something that is often the face of classical music, like an orchestra, I imagine that's what most people of the public would imagine. Do you think there is room to change how music is gate kept, I suppose? Absolutely.
And I can only speak, I mean, since I've spent a large part of my time in America and know the American orchestral scene a little more than the Australian or European, but yes, I think I personally believe that musicians should be the ones who determine how their music is played and heard. I think once musicians have a healthy fear, not depending on anyone else for their success, but when they're responsible for their own success, they'll make the right decisions. They will. Their livelihood depends on it. And that's why I feel that in America, at least, we should look at maybe the Vienna Philharmonic model where the musicians run the show. Obviously, patronage, philanthropy and patronage is totally different here in the States, and that has to be factored in. But I think musicians and board members, the ones who contribute to their cultural institution, should be equal partners in governance. I think that will go a long way towards fixing what's wrong with classical music in America. When your livelihood is on the line, you'll start making the right decisions in order to survive. And I think it's the musicians who have to have more of a say, again, in how their music is played and how their music is heard.
Do you think then in terms of moving towards this kind of more equal governance model, that the musicians themselves should occupy some of the positions that are, say, on the board, who I think often determine what happens in terms of programming and seasons?
Well, I think in America, the board, I think board members are the good guys here. Board members are I mean, they invest. They're not paid to be on the board as corporate board members are. They give a lot of money. I mean, they have a minimum of sometimes $10,000-$20,000 a year to contribute. They trust that they should trust that the mission is being carried out by management. My wish, my king for a day wish is that musicians and board members work together to plan programming and the direction of the institute. I think, I'm very grateful for a 40-year career in music. I mean, I'm grateful to the ones who have hired me. Most of them weren't musicians. They were, as you said, gatekeepers. They were the administrators, and I've maintained close friendships with many of them. I just think in order for us to go forward, musicians are going to have to be given a much larger role in determining how the cultural institutions survive. So I think an educated musician, one who knows about philanthropy and patronage and accounting and math and how nonprofits work and yes, public speaking and entrepreneurship and brand management, all of these things. So we're talking about the end game here, but there's a large responsibility for the educational institutions that feed these musicians into these orchestras and performing arts organizations. So I think it's not only the responsibility of the professional organizations, but also of the schools that need to prepare musicians to be independent contracting musicians who understand nonprofit governance.
Not to throw my own conservatorium under the bus, but all those business skills you just listed, I was not at all. It was never part of the conversation of my education that we needed to acquire any of those skills in order to survive as a classical musician. Of course, I learned that pretty quickly once I left my undergraduate degree, that I definitely needed it to function as a freelancer. But I feel as if there should be a shift in the conservatorium model to teach us how to operate in this contemporary landscape. I was actually having a peek through your Center of Strings outline, and you have all those business skills covered. Was that something that was definitely something you needed to have as part of your structure for the center itself?
That was a deal breaker for me. If we didn't have that, I would have closed the school down. I personally feel you went to a conservatory. I went to a conservatory. I think in the 21st century, these great schools, I mean, Juilliard is one of the greatest schools on the planet. Curtis is fabulous. Colburn is great. I mean, many of my students who graduate from my undergraduate program end up going and getting their postgraduate degrees at Juilliard and Colburn, and we just had our first Curtis graduate as well. But I don't see a healthy future for American conservatories unless they merge with a larger university where they can develop a more hybrid degree that includes music, liberal arts, and yes, business, and to prepare the 21st century musician for an ever-changing world. And I think it's getting pretty late. I mean, we have to, we have to find relevance again. It's just too great of an art form, and the current model, in my opinion, doesn't meet the needs of musicians or concert goers or future concert goers.
In that we need to think more holistically in terms of education and access.
Holistically, yes. The business component is crucial. It's just crucial. My students, so I have an undergraduate institute at Mercer University in my hometown in Macon, Georgia, and we tap into the university orbit where we have lawyers teach contract law and dispute resolution. We connect with the business school on the accounting and the brand management and marketing and those things. And yes, liberal arts for philosophy and reading, religion, whatever. I mean, it's certainly need a complete, I think, musician. My beef is with the schools of music in the universities. I think there's too much music.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's time for independent self-study for musicians. I mean, if you want to, if you really love your art, I mean, you're curious enough. If you're curious enough to learn the music, you'll be curious enough to understand the history behind the music. Mm-hmm. So I think there's some secondary courses in music schools that can be deleted. Secondary piano. I mean, if you can't play piano by the time you get to college, you're not going to play piano. Mm-hmm. So take a business course instead. Or anyway, I just and they're not the degree that we're offering at our university is a Bachelor of Music with electives in business. That's the title of the degree, and these electives are actually requirements. Mm-hmm. And I believe it's the first of its kind in the country. And I just feel that as great as Juilliard is, and Curtis and Coburn and those standalone conservatories, if they don't merge and provide the same kind of degree, I don't want to sound so self-aggrandizing here, but I think we've found the right formula, and I hope that for the sake of us all, I hope that these conservatories take a real hard look at the I think at the disservice. I mean, thousands of graduates from schools of music a year, and there's just not the work out there for them. So this empty promise of come to us and we'll make it possible for you to have that great career you've always wanted, that's false advertising.
Well, I can say, having come from a conservatorium, that I wasn't given the tools to equip myself for working as a freelancer. There was no aid. No one talked about how to get grants written, or no one talked to us about funding or basic things you need to survive as an artist, especially when you're by yourself. So congratulations, because it's the first degree of its kind I've seen anywhere, in Australia, Europe, or the UK, or the US. So I think it's going to make a real difference.
Thank you. Our fingers are crossed, and I think if we look at the smaller collectives, the music collectives out there, Brooklyn Writer, the Knights, Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road. I think there's a group out of Chicago called Fifth House. There's Orpheus, the standalone chamber orchestra here. They're self-governing organizations, yes, smaller and not as many layers, but I think that's a good start for the larger institutions to observe.
For our first intermission is none other than Robert's recording of Mike Mills's concerto for violin, rock band, and string orchestra. This recording is from 2016 and features Robert as a violin soloist. In fact, I remember going to see a collective from America who toured in Australia a number of years ago, Y Music from New York. They were so incredible, and they're also self-governing. And in fact, I was having a conversation with Nadia Sirota afterwards, and the entire conversation was about how to acquire grants and funding, and it was the first conversation anyone had ever had with me about that.
Yeah, grant funding, philanthropy, especially in America. I mean, the government makes it possible to support the arts with these tax laws, tax deductions. But the Gilded Age philanthropists of the early 20th century, Carnegie, Frick, Vanderbilt, those guys, they've been replaced by Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and those guys, besides going out into space, Gates himself cares about world health, and God bless him. I mean, he's more interested in mosquito nets than building a new concert hall, and God bless him. But on the other hand, there's a part of me that says we don't deserve his money because we don't have our house in order. But it's really about tools and relationships when it comes down to it. I think there are, in my experience, I found that benefactors, patrons respond to a sincere appeal. And if they hear it from the artists themselves instead of some paid Harvard MBA development person, it's so much more meaningful, and I think you'll have a greater chance of success. Even if it's a little awkward, it's still sincere, as your music making should be. So I think it's, board members are busy. They have their own jobs, they have their own companies to run. They just want to be, if they feel the institution is in the right direction, and if it's the musicians who decide their own future, to me that's something that board members respond to. Certainly in my experience with the school that I created, and also that I created with many supporters. I couldn't have done it myself. I don't want to sound like I did it, but and also the festival in Italy. I certainly have found out from that experience.
Well, I'm curious in terms of this idea of reforming how certain institutions work. If you're someone who is in an orchestra and you've been in your chair for a while and you are hoping to change the face of the orchestra by being more inclusive with the musicians, how would you practically broach that topic with the management level without seeming confrontational?
Right. Well, every orchestra has its own DNA. Every community has their own, personality. I personally think that if we could somehow get smaller, not regional orchestras, but professional orchestras in America, in places like Charlotte or Richmond or Tucson, those size orchestras, if they just give it a shot and change the model and assign administrative duties to musicians, because these are not 52-week orchestras. In fact, there are very few of those left in America. Maybe we can start a model with a smaller staff, a smaller orchestra. I think if a New York Philharmonic musician just goes in and says, "Let's change everything." I mean, this is going to take a generation or two, I think, to change. And as I said before, it starts with the music schools and the conservatories. They have got to do their part, because if you don't have educated musicians, then you're not going to have the change that is needed.
Well, what I think was lacking when I was at the conservatory was this idea of critical thinking beyond music history or music-specific subjects. So we did an awful amount of music history, which replaced what could have been humanities or access to liberal arts studies and business. And it was primarily dominated by music history. And it was very analytical. I mean, we also had a harmony picture technique, but the historical focus was sort of misplaced if I could say so, to an extent that we forgot we had to relate to a contemporary audience. And in many senses, we have the duty to relate to a contemporary audience. And so I'm really hoping that that does change soon or reform in some way.
Let's take it even farther back. I think it needs to start with the community art schools. That's where you're going to find your brown and black musicians in those schools in the inner cities. And there's such a thirst. I was on the board of the Harlem School of the Arts for 10 years. That is a magical place. Those community art schools need to be lifted up and funded and supported. The schools of music, I believe, have got to change their degrees. I personally feel that even though I'm part of a school of music at my university, and I'm proud of everyone there, I don't think a university should even have a school of music. I think I think there should be obviously music training, but there are just too many music courses in a university. You mentioned music history. I've gotten a lot of pushback on this, but my Lord, music history is usually taught by, oh my gosh, I'm going to get a lot of flack for this. Taught by a new professor who has, a passion for, I don't know, Cambodian percussion instruments or something. And you have to just spend your whole semester instead of it. But if you're learning late Beethoven quartets, that's what you should be. That's what you should be learning. And on your own time. You mentioned harmony and pitch. Those are important. Those need to be taught, I believe. You have to be, I think theory and solfege are essential. But when you get into the, I don't know, it's a heavy lift. This whole thing is going to be a heavy lift. And because when I started the school at the university, I just been playing concerts as a soloist for 30 years. I didn't know how a university worked and the turf battles. If I had known how a university worked, I would have been too scared to start the school. I was so naive, and that's, I think, the reason we were successful, because I just couldn't believe that there were these obstacles. So anyway, my own, as I said, my king for a day, my own feeling is that I think the music department should probably be part of either a liberal arts school or even the business school, and go from there, and teach and educate musicians for their professional part of their lives, and let the musicians with that knowledge change the culture of symphony orchestras. Because when only 2% of all albums are classical, there's a problem. Mm-hmm. So I think again, the main decisions about survival in classical music have to come from the musicians themselves.
So do you think, in terms of maintaining an audience and the traditional demographic of our audience being kind of in their late 60s to mid 70s, that should change also kind of from the community arts route?
Yeah, I'll just give you, again, I'll give you an example of what we're doing at our school. And I grew up in Macon. I live in New York, but I still talk as if I'm from Macon. So I may say in my hometown of Macon. We're going to give the shot of there are 4 concerts a year. It's the Center for Strings and the principal wind and brass players of the Atlanta Symphony, who are the orchestral mentors for my students. It's kind of an Uber chamber orchestra. 39, 40 people. So it's a perfect orchestra for, Beethoven symphonies, for Mozart, for Haydn, for even Stravinsky and Ravel. We're doing Prokofiev Classical Symphony. But every concert will feature either a conductor, composer, or soloist of color. And Macon is a 65% African-American town. If we only play, music of white guys, really, that's just not sustainable. So the great Otis Redding grew up in my hometown, And his family has continued his legacy with a foundation with young songwriters. So our opening concert is featuring young African-American songwriter performers performing their own music arranged for symphony orchestra. We've invited a local hip hop artist to come, and he has worked with a great arranger on a piece that he wrote. I just gave him 2 conditions. I said, if you don't mind, just make it hopeful and no foul language, if you don't mind. And he said, oh, absolutely. But it's just so great. We're doing that. There's a gospel choir in part of a large African-American mega church in Macon. We're supporting them, and they'll be presenting their music as well. So we think that we're setting a good example, and we know that we're going to have a diverse audience. We know that, and because of their environment, and that's exciting. So they'll be hearing Prokofiev for the first time and cheering on their own, their own family members and their own musical role models. So I think it's, I think that's just something we can do. That's something we have the power to do. And again, I want my students to see that and to see the difference that it makes, and for them to carry that through in their professional lives.
To have more agency over the programming and what difference music can make.
Right, and I for some reason we offering the one contemporary piece on a classical music program it's akin to eating your broccoli. It's gotten that, well, oh my gosh, we have to sit through this before we get to the Beethoven Symphony. I mean, that has to change as well. And that goes back to my don't ever punish the audience mantra.
Thanks to the avant-garde movement of the 70s.
Right. And I got caught up in that. I mean, I played, I used to play a lot of Elliott Carter. I actually respect Elliott Carter a lot. I think there's a place for Elliott Carter's music. I don't think it's for the wider public, but that's my own opinion. But there's certainly Elliott Carter fans out there and contemporary fans. And we'll make that specific to that group.
What's interesting is thinking about modern American music as someone who didn't train in America or is American. I seem to have learnt a lot of contemporary American music as a signal of contemporary classical music in general. For example, Steve Reich and Philip Glass, John Corigliano, and gosh, I'm running out of names, and even Bernstein. It was kind of a representation from when I was studying in a conservatorium of what could happen with contemporary music. And would you say that's down to an entire culture of commissioning during those periods and continually commissioning now?
Well, you just named 4 of the greatest composers of in American history, and again, that goes to they're great because they connected with a larger listening public through recordings or orchestral performances. And yes, commissions obviously were huge. Just on a personal note, I was a very cocky kid at Juilliard. I was concertmaster of the orchestra. I was all I wanted to do was play Tchaikovsky and Sibelius and Beethoven and Brahms. That's all I wanted to do. But there was a competition at school, and the required piece was the Samuel Barber violin concerto. And this was in 1980. So I was 21, and Barber, the concerto was not well known then at all. I mean, I think there was one recording out, an Isaac Stern recording, and I'd never heard it. And I just asked a friend how it ended, and he said, "It ends with great excitement." I went, "Good, I'm going to learn it because I want the applause." It was that kind of just cocky attitude. But once I started learning the piece, there was something. I realized that it was a genuine attempt at beauty, and there was something that was speaking to me, and I started feeling very American and very proud, and I kind of changed my whole outlook. And so I entered the competition and I won it. And the American composer David Diamond had heard the final round, and he asked if I could go to Samuel Barber's home and play it for him. Barber was still alive at the time and was dying of melanoma. Well, I'll tell you, that evening changed my life. Playing a masterpiece for the creator, the person, for the master, actually, truly changed my life. I realized my role as a musician immediately, and that was to be a messenger of great art. And that piece became, the violin concerto has become one of the most recorded pieces now. But because of that style of American music, and then even shifting into Philip Glass, those pieces spoke to me, and that's why I've been promoting those pieces over the last, several decades in order to, when an audience experiences, I think, a musician who is in love with the music he's playing, there's something special. So, again, this goes back to what we were saying earlier, is that I just don't want to commission composers just for the sake of doing it. They have to speak to me, and then the audience will hopefully experience my love for the work.
For our second intermission, it also is a recording that features Robert as the solo violinist. This excerpt is taken from a work Robert had commissioned for him from eminent American composer Philip Glass. This is taken from the third movement of Glass's second violin concerto, the American Four Seasons, and is recorded here by the London Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Maren Alsop. Do you think there are any methods in which that kind of ecosystem of collaboration, well, sort of like collaboration in which you get to engage with a living composer in order to create a new work, could be adopted at a wider scale?
I would hope so. And of course, it's a personal interaction. But when you go to somebody as famous as Philip Glass, I mean, it took me 7 years to get him to write his concerto for me, the American Four Seasons. I mean, but I was just determined. I was just absolutely determined to get him to write that. Of course, he didn't need my support. He was already, Philip Glass when I asked him to do that. But I do think that there've been a lot of relationships started in early years that grew, and yes, I mean, I think musicians have got to be curious, and if they don't, if they just stay tied to the standard canon of classical music, then everybody suffers.
Do you think the orchestral model kind of encourages the opposite of creativity?
What a great question. Yes. Yeah. I think so much has to change. I think concerts have to be shorter. They have to be at a different time of day. There should be no intermission. I mean, it's just we're way behind the larger culture here. So I think the overture, concerto, intermission, symphony, I mean, that works sometimes, and they can work a few times a year, but 50 weeks a year, I don't think so.
It's exhausting for the orchestral members as well, having to churn out that much music.
I know. And in New York, you've got the New York Philharmonic, one of the great orchestras in the world. They play a new program every week. Meanwhile, down the street at Carnegie Hall, you've got Cleveland, Philadelphia, Berlin, Vienna, playing after weeks of preparation. And they are so ready and at the top of their game, where the Philharmonic is just trying to learn new notes 3 days before the concert. So there's this chip on their shoulder, I think, their collective shoulder, knowing that just 10 blocks down the road, there's a much better prepared, orchestra. So you've got that. They're playing a different program every week, and I mean, I think extreme radical changes should be made.
Actually, I feel like I was quite naive because I moved to the UK about 2 years ago. I moved to London because my partner's an orchestral musician, and he moved to London, and it was the place we were always told, oh, it's the place to be if you're an orchestral musician. If you make it through London, you'll be fine. I didn't really understand what that meant because I trained as a composer, so I was out of my depth. Then I realized when we moved here what that actually meant. There are 5 main orchestras in one city. Only half of their members are permanent staff. So if you're a new musician, you get rung up on the day. You have one rehearsal and then you perform at night. And it's just this cycle of kind of being moved between these 5 orchestras all the time, which is totally unhealthy and anti-art making. So I didn't realize that it was such a culture where there was just no preparation for anyone. And as a result, very little musicality if you're a young musician.
And they're underpaid.
Yes, actually only 2 of the orchestras have a salary. And I had no idea that was the case either. So that's mildly upsetting uncovering.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak personally. I mean, I've played in London, but I haven't, and I have such respect for those musicians over there. Mm-hmm. Oh my Lord! But I can see. I mean, I can see a solution for the American problem. Mm-hmm. I can see it. I don't know if it's ever going to be done, but I can see a solution.
And what is the solution, if I can ask?
Different structure in orchestral governance, where instead of board management and then at the bottom musicians, that it's musicians and board together as equal partners running the show. And to the extent that there are administrators, that they answer to the musicians and to the board members. That will work. I know that will work. But the musicians have got to be educating musicians, and that brings me back to the schools and their responsibility.
Yes, there just needs to be a different cultural or ecosystem change to make this healthier for everybody.
Yeah, we're kind of in a rut.
at the moment.
But there are pockets of amazing excitement. I mean, you mentioned Y Music, and I mean, there's some amazing groups out there, and the talent coming out of the conservatories, and the talent is just mind-bending.
Mm-hmm.
Incrociamo le dita. We'll cross our fingers.
Indeed, and there's always hope. I have a few more questions. One which kind of relates to the point you were just making. When I suggest to some music management people or some board members that there could be some slight reformation or introducing new people, new voices, or new music, and kind of altering how things are taught, I'm always met with the argument that it's not economically viable for any change to happen, and that the traditional model is the only one that's sustainable. What would you say to the argument of it not being economically safe?
Well, it's not economically safe now. I mean, if you look at the bankruptcies of American orchestras over the past 15 years,
mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's an intellectually lazy response.
Yes.
That's not the case at all.
I think there might be a tendency to, because something seems conservative, we presume that it's economically safe, even if that isn't reality.
Right. I mean, I just think a little smaller venues, a little downsizing, but more of that, if that makes sense. Just spread that out. Mm-hmm. And I'm hopeful, and there's some very intrepid people out there in our business, even on the management side. I don't want to diss them, wholly. I just think that in this, I just think they can, if they want to leave an institution, they can do it. The musicians are stuck. Mm-hmm. They can hop from one institution to another. Musicians are there. They've committed. They're invested. So, I mean, there are, we need to put a lot of really good minds together and go forward. I personally, I just feel that the end game of my, of this new management model with symphony orchestras can't just happen in the symphonic world. It has to, there has to be partnership with the universities and the schools of music and conservatories who produce the musicians.
Do you think integrating elements of kind of digital interfaces and introducing classical music in more kind of digitally innovative ways is something that will emerge out of particularly these last 12 months that could be a useful?
There were some beautiful performances, weren't there, during mm-hmm. COVID? I think the Rotterdam Philharmonic put out something that was pretty amazing. The Met Opera Gala was fabulous. Absolutely, yes, more digital presence, and you can even look into digital rights as well to support, to support your career. So everything has to be. It's just moving so fast, and we're just a little behind.
Just a little. As in digital rights, do you mean royalties for the orchestras themselves?
Royalties, individuals, yes. I mean, just so the musicians know what they're talking about.
That hadn't occurred to me. I'd only put on a number of small online concerts, and that meant learning about what a video license meant and what a sync license meant. I had never encountered that before the pandemic. So yes, a lot to learn. I actually just have one final question, which is, do you have any advice for up-and-coming music makers?
Well, I mean, stay true to your artistic self. Stay true to your own, musical DNA. Don't try to be someone you're not. I learned from experience, trying to do things others were doing, maybe playing music I didn't love, or so that's number one. Be self-aware. And if you haven't taken any of these courses I mentioned, go audit some courses and at least get a feel. If you're in, if you're in New York, NYU has a great music business program. If you can, there's some way. I know the head of it, so if anybody wants to get in, just give me a call and go sit in the. But yeah, I think being self-aware is the most, important advice right off the bat, and from there, just also be aware of the world around you, the business you're in, but realize that you're a musician first, and if you want to keep making music, then there's some things you're just going to have to do, and that's and that's have the knowledge to build a career. And so yeah, read, and if you're still in school, talk to your dean or your teacher about taking courses in professional branding and management and marketing. Accounting is huge. It's my wife said she cried every day she took accounting. It's incredibly tedious and painful, but I think that's hugely important in this world of ours.
Mm-hmm. And then just learning how to manage your time and actually being aware of what you have access to and help in terms of structures and money and things like that. It's a big one.
Right, and don't be afraid to ask for money.
Yes.
Don't be afraid to ask for money. Mm-hmm. I mean, the worst that can happen is that someone says no. Mm-hmm. But again, if you have a project that you believe in, as I've learned through experience, and I've had rejections, but I found, as I said earlier, people respond to a sincere and honest message, mm-hmm. and you just never know. So don't be afraid to ask for money.
That's really good.
Actually, I do have one quick part of my. Just want to tell you about my entrepreneurship class that I teach every other year, where the final exam is that every student asks for up to $500 from a local business person, and we go through the whole semester just preparing that pitch, and to make it as personal and natural as possible. And I've told the business people, look, if you don't like it, don't give them a cent, don't give them any money. Just this is their exam, this is their final exam, and it's an awkward part of our world, but it's something that we have to know how to do.
Yes, it definitely is. And, I know there were a lot of people, including me, when I first started out, who were very uncomfortable when it came to talking about money in general. But I had to learn to get over it at some point, because you needed to live. And I don't know if this is particularly helpful to anyone listening to the podcast right now, because I am much more inexperienced than you are, of course. But in my whole career of working as a composer, which is not particularly long, I would say it's about 7 years, so I'm still emerging. I think I've written about something insane like 450 grants, of which about, I would say, 20 to 30 were successful. But that's an enormous failure rate. And at the beginning, for a few years, that failure rate was at 100%. But I needed it to not so much be successful, but to start learning how to make work and to make a career out of it. And after a while, you realize you just need the conviction to believe in you and art and the people around you that you're working with to make it happen. So in terms of how much rejection I've had, there's been an awful lot, but I really wouldn't have it any other way.
Well, best of luck to you. Again, if you sounds like you're doing all the right things, and congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Well, we'll see where it goes. Thank you so much again for taking the time to speak with me about my range of odd questions that maybe didn't flow that well together.
You were fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been a whirlwind of a conversation, and I've certainly learned a lot about where music should, can, and needs to go. So to everyone listening out there, Information about Robert McDuffie and his work and his Centre for Strings is available to check out in the description and the transcription. I urge everyone to check them out and consider the possibility of self-governments, musical autonomy, and integrating the arts with business. Thank you all for listening, and catch you all next time.